With the end of the Napoleonic Wars, France faced a precarious situation. In defeating Napoleon, the Allies had occupied the country. This was unprecedented in the country's modern history, and many citizens expressed shock and bafflement. The poet and statesman François-René de Chateaubriand despaired at the sight of Russian Cossacks meandering around the courtyard of the Louvre in the winter of 1814, remarking sullenly that the barbarians of the East had now invaded the heart of civilization. The country was divided into zones of occupation, and foreign troops would remain in the country until France managed to pay off the war indemnity imposed on it. In addition to this situation, various questions remained. Who was to govern France following the revolution in Napoleon? How were the Allies to address the legacy of the revolution? More importantly, could France be rehabilitated and ensure that it no longer posed a threat to the peace and stability of Europe? None of these questions had easy solutions. As well, the years of the revolution had given birth to new political ideas regarding government and society. In the aftermath of the French Revolution, it was uncertain how and whether the need for order would be able to accommodate ideas of liberalism and republicanism. Moreover, if the years of the revolution had given rise to new ideas of popular participation and democracy, they had also produced reactionary ideas as well. In the post-revolutionary period, these conservative voices were going to pose new challenges as French politicians and elites desperately sought to impose order on a country which, according to one French statesman, remained hopelessly cut in two between those who supported the revolution and those who vehemently opposed it. In every respect, the post-revolutionary period would constitute a quest for the order and stability which the French Revolution had undermined. Radical attacks on Christianity and God had offended Catholic sensibilities in France. The clergy was especially critical of the Enlightenment and Revolution, seeing it as an attack on the natural order of society. The Enlightenment, with its secular and democratic ideas, had unleashed man's most excessive, violent, and indulgent impulses. It had been bent on nothing short of the complete destruction of society, and this had led to the mayhem and anarchy of the Jacobins, Catholic polemicists claimed. As the call went, c'est la faute de Rousseau, c'est la faute de Voltaire. It's Rousseau's fault, it's Voltaire's fault. These types of criticism became the foundation of a counter-Enlightenment movement across Europe, one that saw a direct link between the values of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. These views became especially strong among the Royalist and Catholic émigrés that fled the country during the 1790s. Their attachment to monarchy was a key ideological factor that united them. In their eyes, the revolution had attacked the legitimate authority of monarchy. It had replaced traditions of royal leadership with the sovereignty of the people. Yet popular sovereignty was sanctioned by neither tradition nor God. It was therefore an aberration that could only lead to chaos. Without legitimate authority, there could be no peace and no order. Therefore, these émigré communities became strong advocates of a new political principle: legitimism. This view saw dynastic monarchy as the only valid form of government. Europe's political traditions were at heart royalist. Monarchy was what connected past and present. It also provided stability through the transfer of power from king to prince. Monarchs preserved moral authority through the close alliance between the crown and the church. Without these forms of legitimate authority, society would dissolve into anarchy. Therefore, in order to correct the excesses and fallacies of the French Revolution, it was essential to restore monarchy to its rightful and traditional place at the head of the state. These views stressing religious and royalist values became popular among émigrés who watched in horror as kings were deposed and murdered, as religious institutions were destroyed, and aristocrats fled into exile. The entire world that they had known was crumbling, and the cause of it was the revolution playing out in France. One such émigré was Joseph de Maistre, an aristocratic political writer who had spent the years of the revolution abroad, watching his native country fall to pieces under men like Robespierre and Napoleon. De Maistre had left his native Savoy and took up residence in Switzerland and Italy. As French armies swept into Central Europe, he fled to Russia, where he endured cold winters and longed to return once again to his Savoyard homeland. During his years of exile and after, de Maistre vehemently denounced the revolution and its ideals. In de Maistre's opinion, it was the will of God, not the reason of man, that was the source of all law and order in society. The Enlightenment and Revolution were founded upon false principles that were hopelessly flawed. As de Maistre saw it, the revolution symbolized God's divine wrath. Just like the Great Flood that God had used to wipe out a wicked mankind in the Bible, so too was the revolution a divine form of punishment. The Enlightenment had instructed that human reason alone could create the world. It had encouraged people to question their faith and believe that they could found social and political institutions in opposition to God's divinely ordered society. These assumptions had been false and blasphemous. The warfare, tyranny, and bloodshed that had accompanied the revolution was God's wrath upon his ungrateful children, a divine punishment intended to convince man of the errors of his way. In the aftermath of this divine punishment, it was essential to reimpose God's order, since the evil influences that had fought against God had now been wiped out and the world purified. If France were to enjoy peace and stability, the key was religious stability, and this meant combating and completely erasing the influence of the Enlightenment. These ideas became the basis of a new ideology in France known as ultra-royalism, a right-wing movement bent on undoing the revolution and returning society to an idealized past vested in the sovereignty of God and monarch, not the people. In the minds of these so-called ultras, the revolution had disrupted France's traditions, and until these traditions of Catholicism and monarchy were successfully restored, French society would never know true peace and stability. De Maistre and his cohorts envisioned a particular type of organic society. The Bible taught that man was imperfect. He could therefore not hope to create a perfect society. Only God could promise this. For these right-wing religious writers, society derived from traditions, history, and religious unity. This is what the revolution had set out to destroy. And in its aftermath, this is what had to be preserved and protected. To settle the question of government in France, the Allies restored the former Bourbon monarchy to the throne in 1814. Louis XVIII, brother of the executed Louis XVI, had led a court in exile during the French Revolution, never giving up his hope of restoring his family once again to the throne. When Napoleon fell, Louis and his followers saw it as a window of opportunity. They immediately petitioned the Allies to restore the aged king as the legitimate monarch of France. Royalists celebrated the return of the traditional royal family. Naturally, those who had fought for the revolution or supported Napoleon did not. During the end of the Napoleonic Wars, as Napoleon attempted to rally people behind him in a last-ditch effort to defeat the Allies and hold onto his power, Royalists had clashed fiercely with Bonapartist and Republican supporters. Royalist volunteers and bands carried out a vicious war in the South, terrorizing anybody who had collaborated with the revolutionary government. As Napoleon's power collapsed, aristocrats were given carte blanche to take revenge on people who had plundered their estates or perhaps executed members of their family. All Bonapartists were purged from the local offices, imprisoned or hunted down. This pent-up rage held by Royalists exploded in a veritable white terror. This wave of violence was troublesome for the newly restored king, Louis XVIII. While he did not sympathize with the Bonapartists or Republicans, he was not necessarily an arch-conservative either. Aged and worn down by years of exile, constant movement, and backdoor politicking, Louis wanted one thing. He wanted peace. As an old man, he wanted only to die on his throne, as he stated, something that his brother had been denied. And he knew that violence and senseless acts of revenge would not obtain this. Pragmatic, Louis realized that hardline conservatives would have to be curbed, and he surrounded himself with more moderate ministers who would work to secure peace in France. In essence, the return of the Bourbons would not signal turning back the clock on the revolution. The revolution had changed French society irrevocably, and Louis understood that he would have to rule with a constitution if he intended to prevent another revolution. However, the traditional pillars of the old regime, namely the nobility and the clergy, also had certain expectations, and they looked to the king for support. The church desired to have itself restored as the moral authority of society. The nobility, returning from exile, sought to have their property restored that had been confiscated during the years of the Revolution. These pillars of the old regime found their voice in various émigrés returning to France. Men like de Maistre, who held nothing but disdain for the revolution and everything it symbolized. For them, the revolution had been a movement led by murderers and madmen bent on destroying society and religion. These so-called ultra-royalists supported the restored king, but their support came with a price. They expected a Bourbon to restore the old order. From the very start, these ultras would be a thorn in Louis's side, often proving far more royalist and counter-revolutionary than the king himself. Yet this arch-conservative and counter-revolutionary view was not shared by all members of French society. The revolution had benefited some, especially non-noble groups, the bourgeoisie and the peasantry. Napoleon had promoted non-nobles to bureaucratic posts in his government, while peasants had gained land through the sale of aristocratic estates. In this respect, these groups did not see the revolution as evil and believed that its changes had been beneficial to French society, even if they didn't agree with the violence and anarchy that had broken out with the revolution. Taking his throne, Louis XVIII realized that he would have to balance these two sides if he wanted to retain power in the country. He tried to ignore calls for revenge coming from the Ultra faction and put his faith in a young and forward-looking royalist named Elie Decazes. Decazes was observant to realize that the revolution had created distinct and conflicting political ideologies in France. There were conservatives who supported the legitimate authority of the king. There were liberals who desired a constitutional government. There were Republicans who wanted a democratic state. And finally, there were Bonapartists who supported the empire. Due to the ideological divisions created by the revolution, Decazes realized that any post-revolutionary government in France was going to have to pander to at least some of these factions if it wanted to remain in power. French government could not afford to define itself too narrowly, lest it invite another revolution. To this end, Louis accepted a liberal constitution. The new government setup had two houses, a House of Peers and one of Deputies. Peers were composed of the nobility and clergy, which embodied the spirit of the old regime. Deputies were elected through popular suffrage, thereby conceding to the democratic aspirations of the revolution. However, voting rights were only given to a limited number of property holders or those wealthy enough to pay a 500 franc tax, a sum beyond the means of peasants and workers, as well as a great portion of the middle classes. Under the new electoral laws, some 90,000 people were given the right to vote in a country counting about 30 million inhabitants. Louis intended to rein in royalist violence. Rather than hunting down revolutionaries in the countryside, royalists could now seek to redress their grievances through the House of Peers legally. Yet if Louis sought to appease ultras in this way, he also promoted some policies in line with the interests of the middle classes, encouraging limited economic interests and business ventures from which these groups could profit. The new non-noble middle classes were also permitted to defend their interests in the House of Deputies, ensuring that they had institutional channels to vocalize their concerns and defend their economic interests. On the whole, this balancing act worked, although neither side was necessarily happy. It did, however, maintain peace, and Louis got his wish. In 1824, Louis died on his throne, an unremarkable king in many respects, but one who had charted a path toward reconciling the old hatreds and animosities created by the revolution. Yet Louis's death posed a problem for the future. Ascending the throne in his place was his brother, the Comte d'Artois, who took the throne as Charles X. Unlike Louis, Charles was hardly a moderate. He had been a consistent supporter of the ultras in his brother's court. It was well known that Charles had never accepted the French Revolution, nor did he feel a king should compromise. In planning his coronation ceremony in 1824, Charles revived the old traditional and religious ceremonies used by the former kings of France. He had himself anointed by the Catholic bishop and wore the traditional gowns of the absolutist monarchs. And this was a sign of things to come. Once taking the throne, Charles began scaling back the Constitution. He imposed censorship on liberal-minded journals. He made blasphemy a punishable crime, stymieing free speech. His education policies catered to Catholic officials. Liberal politicians had been conscious of the growing royalist revival throughout the 1820s. Ultras had successfully used the chamber to punish liberals, often pegging them as dangerous conspirators and radicals. The fact that conspiratorial circles in Spain and Italy were fomenting revolt did not help, creating an atmosphere of suspicion that liberals found difficult to shake. In 1821, one of the foremost spokesmen for the liberal faction, François Guizot, published a pamphlet insisting that not all liberals were revolutionaries. In fact, he claimed, most liberals were men of principle. They were law-abiding citizens who supported order and good government, and therefore they should not be punished for the deeds of a few left-wing radicals. But such pleas fell on deaf ears, and under Charles X, liberals found themselves subject to police surveillance, censored, and harassed by officials. In their defense, liberals began mobilizing opposition to the king, essentially dividing French political society along ideological lines. And as liberals began winning electoral seats, the royal government became nervous. In July of 1830, Charles announced he was invoking his royal prerogative to dissolve Parliament and call for new elections. Liberals feared that this meant he was intending to abolish the Constitution altogether, prefiguring a royalist coup. In late July, these pitched political battles spilled into the streets with demonstrations. When the military was called in, a riot ensued. Paris was once again in the throes of revolution. Charles was not about to stick around in this atmosphere and immediately packed his bags and fled to England. With the royal government gone, the opposition officially declared the Bourbons illegitimate and set to the task of creating a new government. Upon hearing of the unrest, a small group of liberal politicians and journalists gathered in the Parisian office of a prominent newspaper and there planned a course of action. At the meeting, it was proposed that a junior branch of the royal family, the Orleanist line, should be invited to take the throne and establish a new government. As the prominent liberal Adolphe Thiers explained, the time had come for a truly representative monarchy, one that owed its crown to the people and, most importantly, to the liberals. To this end, an invitation was sent out to the Orleanist heir, Louis Philippe, asking him to come to Paris and serve as a constitutional monarch. Republicans, however, had a different idea. Tired of kings and demanding a democratic government, they reached out to the famous Marquis de Lafayette, inviting him to be the president of a new French republic. Lafayette had fought in both the American and French revolutions. During the early 1820s, Lafayette had played a key role in the underground politics of the Liberal International, corresponding with thinkers in Spain and Britain. His revolutionary credentials were impeccable. He was a near mythic figure for Republicans, a founding father just like George Washington, of whom Lafayette was also a personal friend. The problem was that Lafayette was an old man at this point. At the age of 73, he had no intention of heading a revolutionary government. It seemed that a new round of fighting was about to erupt between liberals and Republicans. And so to prevent this, the liberals took action. They approached Lafayette and asked him to give his public support to Louis Philippe, thereby winning Republican support for a constitutional monarchy. Lafayette agreed to do this for the sake of the country, knowing that his endorsement would win over Republicans. And so, a few days later, Louis Philippe and Lafayette appeared on a balcony before a crowd. Lafayette extended his arm to the new king. Louis Philippe accepted his hand, and the two embraced, draping themselves in the revolutionary tricolor flag. As calculated, Lafayette's endorsement won over the Republicans, and following this exchange, Louis Philippe took the throne as the citizen king of France. As he claimed, he would rule in the name and interests of the French people who had offered him the throne. The so-called July Monarchy, headed by Louis Philippe, marked a new phase in French royal government. For starters, it openly disavowed any attachment to the royalist faction that had backed the Bourbons. Instead, the government associated itself with a new group, the bourgeoisie. The July Monarchy pledged to represent the interests of this class rising to predominance in French society. In fact, Louis Philippe himself cultivated an image as a bourgeois par excellence. He dressed in plain clothing rather than royal gowns. He spoke about industry and business. He supported family values and bourgeois morals in public speeches. He also tied his government to the ideals of the French Revolution and the spirit of 1789. Church and state were separated, entailing that the clergy no longer had an unquestionable advantage in the area of national education. A new education curriculum was insisted upon by none other than the liberal François Guizot. This so-called Guizot Law would effectively sideline Catholics in education, continuing the policies of secular state education first put forward by Napoleon. The national electoral laws were also revised. Voting rights were extended to a greater portion of the population, bringing a wider segment of the middle classes into politics. The poll tax was reduced to 200 francs, allowing for more representatives to assume seats in the national parliament. Whereas some 90,000 had been able to vote under the Bourbons, new electoral rights were given to some 500,000, which was still a minority in the country of 35 million. Industrialization was also encouraged by Louis Philippe and his new ministers. Under the July Monarchy, a railroad boom seized France. Industrial ventures were spearheaded and banks began extending lines of credit. France effectively became an industrial power under the Orleanists. In 1840, Louis Philippe selected the seasoned liberal François Guizot as his prime minister. Guizot had been a member of the opposition under the Bourbon Restoration. His liberalism was clearly evident, and not just in his policies either. His entire outlook on society was informed by liberal attitudes. According to Guizot, it was essential that government be based on principles, not ideological interests or specific issues. For Guizot, groups like the Jacobins had favored ideological interests, and this had generated sharp political conflicts. This had to be avoided. Yet one of the principles that the new government reflected was a controversial one in many respects. It was the idea of natural elitism that many liberals endorsed. Enlightened and talented men, Guizot believed, would naturally rise to the top in a free society. They would earn wealth and social prestige through their natural abilities as long as nothing restricted them. This was precisely why the bourgeoisie was so successful in his opinion. They were self-made individuals. But Guizot went further. Because of their natural talents and abilities, the bourgeoisie was naturally suited for political leadership, he believed. This is why he supported a restricted franchise. Limiting voting rights ensured that reasonable and enlightened men participated in politics. And by this, he meant only those who could pay the requisite poll tax. This would effectively keep out the masses, what liberals often referred to as the horde or the vile multitude. The masses had been the one to empower radicals and men like Robespierre. They did not have the education or proper mindset to make informed and judicious political decisions. On the contrary, the masses reacted on instinct, and therefore they had to be kept out of politics. In fact, when workers and less well-off members of the middle class demanded why they did not have political rights, Guizot would respond with, "Enrichissez-vous," get rich, meaning once you got rich, then you could vote. In this respect, liberals were hardly Democrats, and they did not hide their revulsion for democracy either. Men like Guizot did not believe in abstract equality. Not everyone was equal in their eyes. Certain people, by virtue of their talent and education, were more fit for public life than others. This belief in organic inequality became one of the bases of liberal political philosophy. It was a philosophy that saw society divided along class lines. Prior to thinkers like Karl Marx, liberals were leading the way in an idea of class and class struggle. As Guizot and others saw it, class struggle was central to modern society. In their outlooks, liberals also argued that civil rights were not the same as political rights. While everyone might be equal under the law, they were not equal when it came to political representation. Here was the old division once again between active and passive citizens that had been raised in 1789. It was one that liberals actively upheld, favoring an educated and wealthy voter that had identified with the middle classes or the bourgeoisie. Liberals were constitutionalists, but they were not Democrats. Socialism, as both a social and political philosophy, was a French idea in its origins. It stemmed from the radicalism and egalitarianism of the French Revolution, but it was the atmosphere of the 1830s and 40s in which socialism became a movement in its own right. Moreover, the years of the July Monarchy, a self-proclaimed bourgeois government, provided an environment in which new ideas of social relations and political conflict found fertile ground in France. French industrialization did not proceed as rapidly as British industrialization. Nonetheless, during the 1830s, the French economy was being modernized, thanks in part to the incentives offered by Louis Philippe's government. Just as in England, traditional French artisans found themselves under threat by the new trends in manufacturing and the concentration of capital in the hands of a small group of financiers and entrepreneurs. Given the political temperament and radicalism of Parisian activists, middle-class observers did not hesitate to peg workers as an ever-present danger to order. As one newspaper warned in 1832, there is a class of men whose lack of education and precarious lifestyle places them in a state of dangerous hostility to society. With a boom occurring during the 1830s, French entrepreneurs and bankers saw a golden age of opportunity. They began investing in industrial ventures and railroads, primarily using credit to finance their projects. Yet when the economy took a sudden downturn in the 1840s, French finances were thrown into a state of crisis. When lenders began calling in their loans, French industrialists were unable to pay. To cut costs, employers began downsizing their productivity, which inevitably meant cutting jobs and incurring the resentment of workers. Faced with this situation, it was evident that Louis-Philippe and Guizot's values reflected the bourgeoisie and not the interests of the workers, who had no voting rights. Guizot's admonishment of "get rich" had always appeared callous, but it appeared even more insensitive in an economic climate where jobs were hard to come by and workers faced poverty on a daily basis. Worker militancy had its own unique tradition in France, one largely inspired by radical republicanism and the sans-culottism of the revolutionary period. Jacobinism had never lost its appeal for the far left in France, and it was the radical conspirator Louis-Auguste Blanqui who best carried on this Jacobin tradition. Blanqui was a revolutionary adventurer deeply dedicated to Republican values and the French Revolution. Due to his political activities, he would spend over half his life in jail, earning him the nickname L'Enfermé, or the imprisoned one. Like his Jacobin predecessors, his revolutionary ideas stressed violent struggle and political terror in the quest for equality. Guns and bread, as he put it, were what the workers needed to free themselves from a capitalist system which he equated to a modern form of feudalism. In Blanqui's estimation, true equality would only be achieved by a revolutionary state committed to socialist policies and the people. In this, he looked back to the days of the Jacobin Republic as a model, venerating the men of blood, as he called them. This militant brand of Republican socialism was a minority opinion, however. In fact, more moderate thinkers saw little in this style of revolutionary adventurism. Others did not see capitalism and industrialization as inherently evil. Socialist writers like Charles Fourier even idealized industrial society in certain ways, believing that relations between capitalists and workers did not have to be antagonistic. As he saw it, industry did not need to progress at the expense of exploiting the working classes, and could benefit everyone. To this end, Fourier urged workers to set up self-run communes, imagining small communities which grew their own food, produced their own goods, and distributed the wealth of the community equally. Fourier's ideas were not necessarily unique. Moreover, they were part of a broader intellectual trend in the post-revolutionary period that believed that solving the social question not only entailed poor relief, it required new forms of social organization altogether. Chief among these socialist idealists was the philosopher Henri de Saint-Simon. Although hailing from an aristocratic family, Saint-Simon was hardly a typical aristocrat. He not only claimed to be descended from Charlemagne, which was probably not true, but he also claimed that his illustrious forebearer appeared to him in dreams, telling him he was destined for great things. Despite his social pedigree, Saint-Simon despised lazy and self-interested aristocrats who contributed nothing to society. For Saint-Simon, work was the important thing, and not just any type of work either. Industry, technology, and scientific endeavors. These were the types of work that modern society required. Saint-Simon had a distinct vision of society and what it ought to be, namely, a truly organized machine. And yet, this is not what he saw around him. Everywhere he looked, Industry was inviting chaos. It was generating conflicts between employers and workers. There existed little coordination between the economy and the government. For Saint-Simon, an industrial economy required organization and maintenance. It had to run effectively like a machine. In order for this to occur, the state had to abandon a laissez-faire approach and get involved in managing it, and not just supervise it either, but actually oversee and take charge of all society's productive forces. In this respect, the state would take a direct role in stimulating industries, running the economy, and negotiating with workers. It would create complete harmony between industrialists and the working classes, between the rich and the poor, and it would ensure that all ran smoothly. This type of state could not be run by a king or parliament, he believed. Only those capable of understanding the complexities of an industrial economy, of mobilizing resources and applying scientific knowledge to practical problems were fit to rule. A technocratic elite that would promote progress, develop industries, and work to organize society along rational and efficient lines. Saint-Simonism was an attractive philosophy to many intellectuals during the 19th century, and the movement found a great number of adherents, both in France and internationally. Its appeal was in its vision of a progressive and modern industrial society, one that was free of conflict. Its emphasis on social management spoke to both the principles of the Enlightenment as well as the utopianism bred from the years of the French Revolution. However, its authoritarian and even anti-democratic basis did not necessarily sit well with Republicans and Democrats. This would be especially true of the social Republican Louis Blanc. Although rejecting the radicalism of men like Blanqui, Blanc did support solid Republican ideas of popular sovereignty and the will of the people. In fact, rights were central to his political philosophy. Men had natural rights, but they also had a right to work, he argued. Without this right, all other freedoms were pointless. An individual had to be economically independent in order to exercise their freedoms. In a modern wage labor society, the right to life was dependent upon the ability to support oneself. Without an income, a person could not live, and this entailed that employment was a right that should be guaranteed, just like the right to free speech or political expression. Blanc's socialism looked back to the democratic traditions of French republicanism. It eschewed political violence, but insisted that the state had an obligation to its citizens to create a moral and just society that could accommodate workers in the modern age. Taken together, these diverse opinions revealed that during the 1840s, French society was divided politically and socially. Political thinkers looked back to the Revolution, but they were also rethinking and reinterpreting its principles in line with the changes wrought by modernization. Yet despite this diversity, one thing was evident. Growing tensions between workers and employers, between liberal politicians and Republicans, and between reformers and revolutionaries, exposed the political fault lines running through French society since 1789. And in the proper circumstances, these divisions had the potential to create an explosive situation. The French politician Alexis de Tocqueville was not being facetious when, taking note of the situation in January 1848, he warned, "I believe we are at this moment sleeping on a volcano." The July monarchy, with its self-described bourgeois politic, had created an atmosphere of political conflict in which class was central. For the left, opposition became worker opposition, and the social question became linked to ideas of social equality that trace their origins back to the French Revolution and the principles for which it stood.